In the spring of 1834, 3 members of the Whitmore family in Charleston, South Carolina died within hours of each other after consuming a birthday cake baked by the slave who had served them since childhood. The deaths were initially attributed to spoiled ingredients or natural illness, but when investigators discovered the baker's own birthday coincided with the day of the deaths, they began asking different questions. What they uncovered in the plantation kitchen was not a simple case of poisoning, but a decades-long story of cruelty, patience, and a revenge so methodically planned that it had been growing since the killer was barely old enough to walk. The most disturbing detail, the one that made even hardened Charleston authorities fall silent, was found in a journal hidden beneath the kitchen floorboards. 23 years of recipes, each one marking another humiliation, another punishment, another reason to remember. Before we continue with the story of Marcus and the cake that ended the Whitmore legacy, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear has been buried in Charleston courthouse records for nearly 200 years. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I want to know how far this story of calculated patience travels. Marcus entered the Whitmore plantation kitchen for the first time in March of 1811, barefoot, silent, and already accustomed to hunger. The kitchen itself was a world apart from the fields, an enclosed, sweltering chamber filled with smoke, copper pots, and the constant clatter of spoons and knives. To most, it was a place of servitude and heat. To Marcus, it would become both prison and classroom. He was 4 years old, small for his age, his ribs faintly visible beneath the coarse linen shirt someone had given him that morning. His mother had died 2 months earlier during childbirth, leaving him without protection, and the mistress, Constance Whitmore, had made the decision to train him for house service rather than send him to the fields. It was a decision made without thought, but it would determine the shape of his entire life. The cook who ruled that kitchen was a tall, broad-shouldered woman named Aunt Hester, who had been born in bondage but carried herself with quiet authority. She spoke little, but her eyes told stories Marcus would only understand years later. On his first day, she showed him how to carry water from the pump without spilling a drop, how to keep his eyes lowered when the mistress entered, and how to move silently through the room when tempers were high. "You listen before you move," she told him once, her voice low enough that the white overseer wouldn't hear. "Listening will keep you alive longer than running ever will." Marcus learned quickly. He learned that the rhythm of the kitchen dictated the rhythm of the plantation itself, the beating heart of the house where every meal was an offering of labor and humiliation. He learned that the smell of roasting meat or baking bread carried upward through the floors, while those who made the food would never taste it. He learned the names of herbs before he could read them, memorizing how a pinch of one leaf could sweeten and another could silence. In the evenings, when the house finally slept, Marcus would sit near the dying embers of the hearth and trace the patterns left by spilled flour or ash. Sometimes, Aunt Hester would hum an old song, the words swallowed by years of fear. Marcus didn't understand the language, but the melody stayed with him. It was the sound of memory refusing to die. The Whitmores, Jonathan, Constance, and their young son Thomas rarely entered the kitchen except to issue orders or scold. When they did, the air changed. Marcus noticed how the enslaved cooks stopped breathing when the master's boots crossed the threshold, how Aunt Hester's hands trembled slightly when spoken to directly. Jonathan Whitmore had the smooth manners of Charleston gentry, but his cruelty was quiet and meticulous. A misplaced knife, an undercooked dish, a moment's hesitation, all could earn a blow. And though Marcus was too young to understand the politics of power, he understood pain, and he understood the way silence became a shield. By the winter of 1812, Marcus could prepare bread dough on his own, grinding cornmeal, measuring salt by instinct, kneading until his small hands ached. He never spoke unless asked a question. The older servants began calling him Shadow Boy, because he seemed always to appear when needed, never when not. Constance Whitmore took particular satisfaction in his obedience. To her, he was proof that even the youngest could be trained to serve flawlessly. To Marcus, Her approval meant only fewer bruises, and the privilege of sleeping near the warmth of the kitchen fire instead of the cold storage shed. But beneath his quiet compliance, something was forming, an awareness too subtle for a child but too sharp to ignore. He noticed which ingredients were locked away and which were left within reach. He learned which bottles on the pantry shelves were meant for flavor and which carried warnings of skulls and bones. He watched, and he remembered. The night before his 5th birthday, Aunt Hester slipped him a small piece of leftover cornbread and whispered, "You got your mama's eyes, boy. Keep 'em open." Marcus didn't yet understand the warning, but in years to come, when the kitchen became his domain and the Whitmore family his study in human cruelty, he would recall that moment, the flicker of firelight, the whisper of defiance, and realize it was the first seed of what would become his long, quiet plan. The summer of 1812 came early to Charleston, the kind that wrapped the air in heat so thick it slowed every movement to a crawl. Inside the Whitmore kitchen, where the ovens burned from dawn until long past sunset, the air shimmered like glass. Marcus had learned to ignore the sting of sweat in his eyes, the burn of hot iron near his arms, the ache that came from standing still for hours. He was 5 years old now, and the small child, who once trembled at every voice, had been replaced by something quieter, watchful, and far older than his years. That August morning began like any other. Constance Whitmore wanted a grand breakfast for visiting guests: baked ham, honey biscuits, preserved peaches, and eggs prepared precisely the way her husband preferred. Aunt Hester moved about with calm efficiency, her large hands steady even as the mistress barked orders from the doorway. Marcus, standing on a wooden crate to reach the serving table, carried the heavy silver platter piled with biscuits, the smell of butter and sugar rising in waves. The tray wobbled as he turned toward the dining room, and before he could correct himself, one biscuit slid free and hit the floor. The sound was small, a soft, muffled thud, but in the stillness that followed, it might as well have been a gunshot. Jonathan Whitmore's chair scraped against the polished floorboards, and his voice came from the other room, sharp as the crack of a whip. "Who dropped that?" Marcus froze. He looked to Aunt Hester, but her face gave no instruction. There was only resignation there, the look of someone who had seen too many moments like this. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, still in his fine linen shirt, hair neatly combed, a man who considered cruelty a form of education. "Bring the boy here," he said evenly. Constance watched without speaking as Marcus was pushed forward, his small hands shaking around the empty tray. "Hold out your hand," Jonathan ordered. Marcus obeyed. Jonathan picked up a candle from the table, tall, white, beeswax, and tilted it so that the flame licked the wick higher. "When you drop food in this house," he said, "you drop the respect due to it." Then he took Marcus's wrist, holding it steady while the child struggled, and pressed the tiny brown fingers close enough for the flame to bite. Marcus didn't scream, not at first. The smell came before the sound: scorched skin, candle wax, fear. By the time Aunt Hester pulled him back, tears streamed down his face in silence. Jonathan extinguished the candle with a flick of his thumb and handed it to his wife, as if it were a teaching tool rather than an instrument of pain. "You see," he said, "even a servant can learn discipline when it's properly applied." Then he sat down to finish his breakfast, unbothered. Later that day, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Marcus sat behind the kitchen, his burned hand wrapped in damp linen. Aunt Hester crouched beside him, mixing salve from lard and crushed herbs. "You keep that hand working," she murmured. "Don't let it stiffen. They'd call that weakness." He nodded, biting his lip. "And remember, boy," she added softly, "pain's a teacher too, but it don't always teach what they think it does." That night, Marcus lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. Laughter drifting down the hall, footsteps fading on the stairs, the faint ticking of the mantel clock marking each second between his breaths. His hand throbbed, but beneath the pain was something else, a strange, steady awareness. The candle had burned more than skin. It had seared a lesson into him about power, the kind that hid behind manners and smiled while it punished. From that day forward, Marcus handled every tray, every plate, every bowl, as though it were sacred, not because he feared another punishment, but because he had begun to understand that the kitchen itself, the ingredients, the fire, the food held a power his masters didn't see, and in time, that invisible power would belong to him. By the winter of 1814, Marcus had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the Whitmore kitchen, the endless rising and falling of flames, the soft scrape of iron against iron, the muttered commands of Aunt Hester, and the sighs of the women who worked beside her. He was 7 now, tall enough to reach the counter without a crate, but still too small to escape notice. Every meal he prepared was another reminder that he lived to feed those who would never feed him. Yet within that ritual of servitude, something deeper had begun to stir, a quiet awareness that food was more than survival. It was control. Each day began before sunrise. The house still slept as Marcus stoked the coals, coaxing the dying embers back to life. The smell of wood smoke clung to his skin, mixing with the sweetness of molasses and the sting of vinegar from the previous night's work. He would stand before the fire until his face burned, the rest of him cold from the early chill. He learned to tell time by the color of the flames, pale orange for dawn, deep red for supper, and black ash for exhaustion. The Whitmores demanded extravagance at every meal. Jonathan Whitmore measured wealth, not only in land or cotton, but in how richly his table groaned beneath its burden. There were always roasts, glistening with fat, candied fruits, imported wine, and pastries filled with cream that would never touch the lips of the enslaved. Marcus, who prepared it all, watched the family eat through the narrow crack of the dining room door. He saw how Constance dabbed her mouth with linen between each bite, how Jonathan gestured grandly with his fork while lecturing his guests, how their young son Thomas threw food to the floor when displeased. The scraps from those feasts became the evening meal for the kitchen hands, crusts of bread soaked in grease, fruit rinds, bones picked clean. It was survival, but barely. On some nights, when the hunger grew sharp enough to dull the mind, Marcus would sneak a spoonful of something from the pot before it was served, tasting what he'd created. The first time he did this, he expected guilt or fear to follow. Instead, he felt a strange rush of defiance. That single bite of food meant for others was his rebellion, small but intoxicating. One evening, after a grand dinner for a visiting judge, Marcus was left to clean the kitchen alone. The fire had burned low, and the air was thick with the scent of fat and smoke. He looked around at the half-eaten dishes cooling on the counter, a roast duck, untouched biscuits, the remains of a sugar pie, and something inside him hardened. He gathered the discarded portions and placed them carefully into a bowl, setting it by the hearth where he sat cross-legged on the floor. Slowly, methodically, he ate, not out of hunger, but out of principle. Each bite was bitter with ash and salt, but he swallowed anyway. It was his way of consuming what had consumed him. That night, Aunt Hester found him there, surrounded by the remains of the Whitmores' feast. "Boy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you courting death sitting here like that." Marcus looked up at her, his face illuminated by the dying fire. "They leave it for us," he said simply. "Why shouldn't I eat it warm for once?" Hester stared at him for a long moment, then sighed, lowering herself beside him. Together, they finished what was left, saying nothing. From then on, Marcus began to see food differently. He learned which ingredients made people feel heavy, which made them restless, which soothed the stomach or made it burn. The Whitmores thought him obedient, but in truth, he was studying them, their habits, their appetites, their weaknesses. The dining room became his laboratory, the kitchen, his archive. Every spice, every taste, every reaction etched itself into his mind. Years later, when strangers would read the pages of his hidden journal and wonder how a single cake could undo an entire family, they would never understand that it began here in the ashes of the Whitmores' kitchen, where a 7-year-old boy first tasted power disguised as hunger. Marcus discovered his own birthday entirely by accident. It was the spring of 1815, and he was 8 years old, his hands already calloused from years of kitchen work. The morning began like most others. He rose before dawn, swept the ashes from the hearth, and helped light the new fires. Aunt Hester had been gone for 3 months, sold south after a dispute with the overseer, and the kitchen felt emptier without her steady humming. In her absence, Marcus had taken on more work, kneading bread, peeling vegetables, and preparing the ingredients for the Whitmore family's breakfast. The kitchen had become both his classroom and his cage, a place where he learned to measure obedience in silence and rebellion in thought. That day, the plantation's bookkeeper, Mr. Farrow, came into the kitchen to check inventory. He was a thin man with a nervous cough, who always smelled faintly of ink and tobacco. Marcus had learned that Mr. Farrow kept records of everything: how much flour was used, how many eggs were laid, even how many pounds of butter the Whitmores consumed in a week. As Marcus swept near the pantry door, he heard the scratch of a pen and Farrow's voice reading from a ledger. Jonathan Whitmore, born April 17, 1775, and Marcus, male child, born April 17, 1807. The words barely registered at first. Marcus froze mid-sweep, his heart thudding in his chest. He had never heard anyone speak his birth date before, never even known he had one worth recording. It startled him that such a thing was written down, his existence reduced to an entry between flour and salt. Farrow closed the book and left without a second glance, unaware that he had just given a boy the only gift he would ever remember receiving. That evening, Marcus carried the knowledge of that date like a secret flame. He understood little about birthdays, except that they were something celebrated in the big house. Each year, Jonathan Whitmore's was marked by a dinner so lavish it filled the kitchen with days of labor. Pheasant, imported wine, cakes as tall as Marcus's arm. The enslaved children watched from the doorway, too young to serve, too old to pretend they didn't know what they were missing. But now, Marcus realized that his own birth fell on the same day as his master's. The coincidence struck him with a strange, heavy clarity, as though fate itself had made a cruel joke. On the morning of April 17th, Marcus rose earlier than usual. The air smelled of rain and yeast. The Whitmores were busy preparing for Jonathan's birthday dinner, and the kitchen buzzed with orders. Marcus was told to polish the silver and sweep the floors twice over. He worked with mechanical precision, but his thoughts drifted. While the household celebrated the birth of a man who owned hundreds of lives, Marcus quietly counted the years of his own captivity 8, though he understood that number only in relation to his labor, not his freedom. That night, after the guests had gone and the dishes were scrubbed clean, Marcus slipped into the pantry. The room was dark except for the faint glow of embers from the stove. On the shelf sat the remnants of a small cake, a confection left half-eaten, its frosting smudged. He hesitated, then took a piece no bigger than a thumb. It was sweet, heavier than anything he'd ever tasted, and for the first time in his life, he smiled while eating. It was his birthday too, even if no one else knew it. But the moment didn't last. The next morning, Constance Whitmore discovered that someone had touched her husband's cake. Every servant was questioned, each one denying it. When it came to Marcus, he told the truth too young, yet to understand the cost of honesty. The punishment came swiftly, a week of confinement in the smokehouse, fed only scraps. Yet even there, surrounded by the scent of cured meat and damp ash, Marcus thought of that single bite, the taste off of sugar and defiance, and he knew something had changed. It was the first time he marked the passage of his own life, the first time he claimed a moment as his own. And as the years went on, each April 17th would bring with it not celebration, but remembrance. The day that bound him to his master by birth would one day bind them by death. Between 1816 and 1820, Marcus mastered the most dangerous skill an enslaved servant could possess: the ability to hear everything and speak of nothing. By 10 years old, he had learned to move through the Whitmore house as quietly as breath itself, carrying trays, clearing dishes, and tending fires without drawing a single glance. The Whitmores had grown so accustomed to his invisibility that they spoke freely in his presence, forgetting he was even there. It was in those years that Marcus began collecting more than recipes. He was collecting information, each overheard argument, each whispered secret, each careless admission of sin. The house itself was a monument to contradictions. Its grand white pillars gleamed in the Charleston sun, but its foundation rested on years of suffering buried beneath the soil. Inside, Every polished surface reflected a life of refinement, built on unrefined cruelty. Constance Whitmore ruled the household with the precision of a general, her days consumed with appearances, menus, guest lists, the placement of lace and silver. Yet behind the parlor's closed doors, her voice could cut through silence like a blade, particularly when her husband failed to bring in the profits she demanded. Jonathan, meanwhile, had the temperament of a man used to being obeyed. When the markets fell or the crops underperformed, it was not the economy that bore his anger. It was his household. Marcus saw it all. He learned to recognize the early warning signs, the tightness in Jonathan's jaw before a storm of violence, the way Constance's hands trembled just slightly when she prepared to lash out at a servant. On those nights, he would move the kitchen staff faster, clear the dining room earlier, ensure no sound could give the master reason to notice them. He learned how to vanish before trouble arrived and how to return when it was over, ready to serve as if nothing had happened. But silence was not simply a means of survival. It became a form of study. At supper, he would stand near the doorway and listen to the Whitmores talk as if the walls themselves were deaf. He learned that Jonathan had debts he hid from his wife, that Constance despised her sister for marrying into a wealthier family, that their son Thomas had inherited both parents' arrogance but none of their restraint. These were not mere observations, they were the raw materials of understanding. Marcus began to see that the Whitmores were no stronger than the people they enslaved. Their power depended on the illusion that they were untouchable, and illusions, he realized, could be broken. On rare afternoons, when the family visited town, Marcus would be left alone in the house. He would wander the hallways, touching the furniture he had polished 100 times, tracing the grain of the wood as if memorizing it. He would pause before the parlor mirror, seeing his reflection framed by wealth he could never possess. But what struck him most was how empty the house felt without voices to fill it. In that silence, he could almost believe he owned it himself. One evening, after a particularly violent quarrel between Jonathan and Constance that left a vase shattered across the floor, Marcus knelt to sweep up the shards. Thomas, then 9 years old, stood nearby watching him. "You look like a mouse when you do that," the boy said, grinning. Marcus kept sweeping. "Do you ever talk, or are you dumb like they say?" Marcus looked up but said nothing. Thomas kicked a shard toward him, laughing when it drew a thin red line across Marcus's knuckle. "If you don't talk, I'll make you." Still, Marcus said nothing. When Jonathan called for his son moments later, Thomas left, disappointed that his game had ended so quickly. Marcus pressed his bleeding hand against his apron and stared at the door long after the boy had gone. Silence, he realized, had power. Words could be used against him, but silence could not. It made him unpredictable, unknowable. By the time he reached 13, Marcus had perfected the art of invisibility so thoroughly that guests sometimes startled when he appeared. To them, he was part of the house, the way the fire always burned or the floor stayed clean. And in that invisibility, he found a strange kind of freedom. He could move, observe, remember. Every word the Whitmores spoke became another stitch in the tapestry of their undoing. Years later, when investigators would read his journal and find the meticulous notes written in perfect, steady hand, they would marvel at how much he knew dates, names, details that only someone inside the house could have recorded. But they would never understand that the habit had begun here, in those silent years, when a boy who wasn't allowed to speak learned how to listen better than anyone alive. When Marcus turned 13, Constance Whitmore decided that a boy his age was old enough to manage the garden behind the kitchen house, a duty meant to keep him busy and useful, but not trusted. The Whitmore garden was no ordinary patch of earth. It spread wide along the southern edge of the property, divided into neat rows of parsley, sage, thyme, and vegetables, bordered by the more delicate plants Constance used for her tonics and restorative teas. To Marcus, it became something else entirely. For the first time in his life, he was allowed to work unsupervised, alone among the rows where the air smelled of earth and sunlight. He learned quickly. The soil itself seemed to speak to him, teaching patience. He learned which plants thrived in shadow and which craved full sun, which wilted when overwatered, and which could survive neglect. Constance instructed him to memorize every herb's use: mint for digestion, chamomile for sleep, pennyroyal for warding off insects. But she did not mention the other truths that lay beneath those polite explanations, the ones whispered among the enslaved healers and root women who passed through the plantation grounds. From them, Marcus began to learn what the Whitmores had never meant for him to know. He learned that foxglove could still a heart as easily as it could steady one, that belladonna, when dried and ground, could blur the edges of sight and reason, that certain mushrooms growing near the swamp carried death in their caps so silent it might take hours to notice. He didn't seek these lessons for revenge, not yet, but because they felt like power, and power was something he had never been allowed to touch. Every morning, Marcus gathered herbs for the kitchen. He tied them neatly with twine, labeling them in Constance's delicate script, which she had made him memorize. In the evenings, when the house slept, he returned to the garden under moonlight and experimented. He crushed leaves between stones, mixed powders with water, observed how the colors changed when heated by the lantern's flame. He began keeping a small notebook, scraps of paper stitched together, with thread recording what he learned in secret symbols so no one else could read them. One humid night in August, he overheard Constance speaking to a visiting neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy. "It's the strangest thing," Constance said. "Jonathan's been plagued with headaches lately. I believe it's the humidity, or perhaps too much Madeira." Marcus froze at the mention. The headaches had begun weeks earlier, short spells of dizziness after meals, a pressure behind the eyes that made Jonathan rub his temples and scowl. No one suspected that the cause came from the garden. Marcus had not poisoned his master. He wasn't yet reckless enough for that, but he had begun testing the limits of what a body could endure. He had learned, for instance, that a few drops of certain tinctures mixed into a stew might cause discomfort but not death. That crushed foxglove leaves steeped too long would bring about vomiting and cold sweats, but could be disguised as illness from spoiled meat. It was experimentation disguised as obedience, science cloaked in servitude. As months passed, Marcus grew bolder. He began blending harmless herbs with small traces of the dangerous ones, just enough to understand their flavor and smell, to see whether those who ate his food would notice. No one ever did. The Whitmores praised his cooking endlessly, complimenting the liveliness of his seasoning, the depth of his sauces. Marcus would bow his head and thank them. But inside, he was learning their palates, their thresholds, their blind spots. Once, Constance summoned him to the parlor to commend him in front of guests. "This young man," she said proudly, "knows more about flavor than many trained chefs. Perhaps one day he'll cook for the governor himself." The guests applauded lightly, thinking it generosity. Marcus simply nodded, his face expressionless. He left the room and returned to his garden, where the night breeze carried the scent of rosemary and decay. He knelt in the dirt and touched the leaves of the foxglove plant, running his fingers over the purple bells as if greeting an old friend. He didn't yet know what he would do with the knowledge he was gathering, but he knew that someday it would be needed, and when that day came, the poison would already be waiting, hiding in plain sight, just as he had learned to do. The summer of 1822 was the kind that left the air heavy enough to drown a man. Every sound on the Whitmore plantation carried through the heat, the buzz of cicadas, the soft creak of porch boards, the distant hum of the river. Marcus was 15 now, taller than most boys his age, but lean, his shoulders hardened by years bent over fires and chopping blocks. The garden had become his refuge, the only place where he could think without being seen. It was there, beneath the shade of the magnolia tree, that he made his first great mistake. That morning, Jonathan Whitmore had left a book on the parlor table, a treatise on domestic economy, its pages yellowed and edges curled. Marcus had passed by with his tray, his eyes catching on the ink, the neat rows of letters he could not yet read but had learned to recognize. For years he'd been watching others write, the bookkeeper with his ledgers, Constance with her household lists, even the preacher who visited on Sundays with his Bible. The sight of words had become an ache in him, something forbidden but irresistible. That day, with the house empty and the windows open to the slow churn of summer air, Marcus reached for the book. He turned the first page carefully, tracing the black print with his finger, as though the letters themselves could whisper their meaning. He didn't hear Jonathan returning from the veranda until the door creaked behind him. "What are you doing, boy?" Marcus froze. The book still lay open in his hands. Jonathan's voice was calm, that dangerous kind of calm that came before violence. "Put it down," Marcus obeyed, lowering the book gently to the table. "Who taught you to read?" "No one, sir." His voice came out as a whisper. Jonathan stepped closer. "You lying to me, Marcus?" "No, sir. I was just looking." Jonathan's hand struck faster than Marcus could flinch. The sound echoed off the parlor walls, the sharp crack of palm on skin. The second blow came with the back of his hand, sending Marcus to the floor. "Looking," Jonathan repeated. "That's what your kind always does, looking where you shouldn't." He kicked the fallen book across the rug. "Readings for men, not property." Marcus tried to crawl toward the door, but Jonathan's boot caught him in the ribs. The air rushed from his lungs in a single ragged gasp. "You want to know what happens to servants who forget their place?" Jonathan's tone was almost instructional now, the same voice he used when explaining crop rotations to overseers. He hauled Marcus up by the collar and dragged him through the hallway toward the veranda. Two other servants looked up from their work but turned away. Faces blank, they knew better than to interfere. Outside, Jonathan forced Marcus's hand flat against one of the porch columns. "Hold still." He picked up a switch from the nearby woodpile, stripped of its leaves. The first lash opened skin, the second drew blood. By the fifth, Marcus could taste iron at the back of his throat. He bit down on it, swallowing both pain and rage. When it was over, Jonathan dropped the switch and wiped his hands as though finishing a chore. "You remember your place now?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get back to the kitchen. There's supper to prepare." Marcus staggered away, every breath burning his chest. In the kitchen, the other servants avoided his eyes. One of the older women pressed a rag soaked in salt water against his ribs. He didn't cry, didn't speak, but that night, lying on the dirt floor of the cookhouse, he traced the welts across his back with trembling fingers and understood something new. Pain didn't just punish it, clarified. For years, his anger had been shapeless, the dull ache of a life endured. Now, it had focus. He realized that Jonathan Whitmore wasn't simply cruel. He was fragile, a man who feared what he could not control. And Marcus, by holding that book, had shown him something to fear. The bruises faded with time, but the memory of that day never did. It became the line dividing who Marcus had been from who he was becoming. After that beating, he stopped dreaming of freedom in the vague way the others did. Instead, he began to think of justice slow, deliberate, and exact, like a recipe that needed years to perfect. It would require patience, precision, and ingredients no one else could see. And one day, he swore, Jonathan Whitmore would taste what it felt like to be powerless. By the spring of 1823, the scars on Marcus's back had hardened into thin, white ridges, pale reminders that healed skin could not mean a healed mind. He had stopped flinching when Jonathan passed by and stopped lowering his eyes when spoken to. He still obeyed, still answered, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," with perfect calm, but inside he was somewhere else entirely, standing in a world he had begun to build word by word, line by line. The book that had earned him the beating had also given him an idea. The words inside it had power, that much he could feel, even if he didn't yet know how to wield it. So Marcus made it his quiet mission to learn. The first lessons came from stolen glances and whispered exchanges. An older house servant named Ruth, one of the few who could read scripture, took pity on him and began teaching him letters using the smudged pages of an old hymn book. They met in the pantry after dark, their voices barely audible over the creak of the house settling for the night. "A for Almighty," she would whisper, tracing his finger across the page. "B for bread." Marcus repeated each sound until the symbols became familiar shapes. Within months, he could copy words even if he didn't fully understand them. Ruth smuggled him scraps of paper, bits of old account ledgers, edges of newspaper, and a stub of charcoal from the hearth. "Write what you need to remember," she told him. "Words don't forget." That phrase stayed with him. Marcus began writing before dawn, when the house was still dark, and the world seemed to belong to him alone. He would crouch by the faint light of the stove, recording everything he saw and heard, the punishments, the lies, the petty cruelties that filled the Whitmore home. He wrote about Jonathan's temper, Constance's obsession with appearance, Thomas's growing arrogance. Each page became a ledger of their sins, written in the same deliberate hand the bookkeeper used to count their profits. But Marcus's journal was more than record-keeping. It was strategy. He started to notice patterns when Jonathan's headaches worsened, when Constance's health faltered, when the family quarreled about debts or gossip from Charleston. He wrote down what each family member liked to eat, how long they slept, what ailments they complained of. Over time, the journal became as meticulous as a recipe book, though its ingredients were not sugar and flour, but names and motives. He hid the pages beneath a loose floorboard under his cot, wrapped in an old apron. No one ever suspected. The Whitmores didn't believe their servants capable of thought beyond obedience. That arrogance, Marcus realized, was their greatest weakness. One evening, while the family dined in the parlor, Marcus lingered by the door, refilling glasses of wine. Constance was scolding her husband for gambling debts, while Jonathan blamed the ungrateful hands in the fields. Their words struck him like sparks falling on dry tinder. Later that night, he returned to his journal and wrote, "They rot themselves from the inside. I need only wait and keep record of it." His handwriting had grown steady now, elegant even, each letter drawn with care. There was power in the neatness of it, the quiet control of a man who observed more than he spoke. By autumn, the notebook had filled half a dozen stitched pages. To anyone else, it might have seemed like the ramblings of a servant. But Marcus knew what it was: proof, a secret map of cause and effect, cruelty and consequence. On the last night of that year, as rain drummed softly on the kitchen roof, he sat by the dying fire and reread what he had written. His eyes moved over the lines slowly, each sentence like a heartbeat. Then he added one final entry for the night. "Every master needs a record. This one is mine, and when the time comes, this book will speak louder than I ever could." He tucked the journal back beneath the floorboard and lay down to sleep, the scent of ash and ink lingering in the air. It was the first thing that truly belonged to him, a creation of his own making, born not of servitude, but of will. And though no one in the Whitmore house would ever see it, that hidden journal was already rewriting the balance of power. By the spring of 1825, the Whitmore plantation had entered a new phase of quiet decay. Jonathan's once thriving cotton business was strained by market changes, and Constance had grown heavier, slower, and more irritable with age. But the most profound change came from their son, Thomas. At 18, he had returned from Charleston, where he had been sent for education and refinement. What he brought back instead was arrogance, sharpened into cruelty. Thomas Whitmore was his father's reflection without restraint. He wore fine clothes, spoke with the rehearsed charm of a young gentleman, and treated pain as proof of power. Within a week of his return, Marcus understood that the household had become more dangerous. The father's punishments had been measured and cold. The sons were impulsive and theatrical. He seemed to take pleasure in finding reasons to display authority, slowness at the table, a misplaced utensil, a glance he deemed disrespectful. On his first night home, Thomas demanded that Marcus personally serve his dinner in the library. Marcus obeyed, carrying a tray of roasted quail, sweet potatoes, and wine. Thomas ate greedily, his lips shining with grease. "Father says you're the best cook he owns," he said between bites. "You know what that makes you, don't you? A valuable tool. And tools don't speak, they don't think, they just do." Marcus said nothing. He placed a fresh napkin beside the young man's plate, bowed slightly, and turned to leave. "Wait," Thomas said. He leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming. "You're supposed to look at me when I speak." Marcus turned. "That's better. I want to be sure you understand something. Around here, I'm the master now. And if I ever find you disobedient even once, you'll learn the difference between my father's temper and mine." It wasn't an idle threat. Within days, the servants began whispering about the new master's amusements. He'd taken to visiting the slave quarters late at night, calling out men and women alike for imagined offenses. Sometimes he punished them himself. Other times he left the work to the overseer while he watched, arms crossed, smiling faintly. The older servants began warning the younger ones to avoid his attention at all costs. But Marcus, bound to the house and kitchen, had nowhere to hide. Jonathan seemed almost proud of his son's harshness. "A man must learn to rule early," he told Constance one evening, unaware Marcus was nearby polishing silver. "Better to be feared than loved. Fear keeps things orderly." Constance, sipping her cordial, nodded faintly. "You've raised him in your image, Jonathan. Let us hope he doesn't surpass you in cruelty." Marcus wrote that conversation down in his journal that night. "He will surpass him," he noted, "and when he does, he'll destroy them both." Over the following months, Thomas inserted himself into every aspect of plantation life. He demanded new recipes, often forcing Marcus to work late into the night preparing elaborate dishes for his amusement. He would stand over Marcus as he cooked, offering mock praise or criticism. "You handle that knife too delicately," he'd say. "You mustn't be afraid of a little blood." Marcus endured it all, with the same expressionless calm he had learned years before. But something inside him shifted each time Thomas spoke. The young master's cruelty was reckless, without patience, without foresight. Marcus saw in him the same weakness he had once seen in Jonathan, but stripped of even the pretense of control. Thomas was vain, easily flattered, and, above all, greedy for admiration, and that vanity would become his undoing. One evening, as Marcus prepared supper, Thomas poured himself a glass of wine and said, "You've got a gift, Marcus. Maybe one day I'll take you to Charleston and show them what a proper servant can do." Marcus nodded, stirring the pot slowly. "Yes, sir," Thomas smirked. "You say that well, almost like you mean it." Marcus said nothing. But later, when he opened his journal, his entry for the night was brief. "The father rules by fear. The son rules by impulse. Both will die by appetite." It was not written in anger or haste, but with the same patient precision that had guided him for years. He had seen enough now to understand that his revenge would not come through force or rebellion. It would come through habit, through the very rituals of the household. The Whitmores believed unshakable. He would not destroy them from without, but from the inside, one meal at a time, one season at a time, until their own table turned against them. Between 1826 and 1829, the Whitmore household began to decay from the inside, though no one yet realized it. The decline was slow, almost imperceptible. A cough here, a fainting spell there, the occasional complaint of sour stomach or sleeplessness. Charleston's physicians blamed it on heat, diet, or melancholy. Only Marcus knew better. He had begun his true work. The first change came in the spring of 1826, when Jonathan Whitmore fell ill after supper. It was nothing dramatic, a mild dizziness followed by nausea that passed before morning. The doctor called it indigestion. Marcus knew it wasn't. The broth Jonathan had eaten that evening contained a trace amount of something Marcus had extracted weeks earlier from the garden, a compound he had tested in small doses on pests and stray animals. Not enough to kill, just enough to linger. Marcus's plan was not vengeance by impulse but by design. He had learned patience from the soil itself, how things grew best when tended quietly, over time. Death, he decided, would be no different. Each member of the Whitmore family became a separate experiment. Jonathan, gluttonous and proud, received the heaviest seasoning in his meals, a pinch added to his wine sauce here, a trace in his tea there. Constance, delicate and vain, required subtlety. He learned that her nightly tonics, mixtures of valerian and rose water, masked bitterness well. For her, he measured doses so carefully that her body adapted to the poison slowly, mistaking it for an illness of nerves. Thomas, now 20, was careless with what he consumed. Marcus took advantage of that. His coffee, his brandy, his late-night desserts, all became channels through which Marcus's quiet alchemy worked. He made notes each night in his journal. The entries read like recipes. January 3rd, father complained of trembling in hands. Dose too strong, reduce by half. February 10th, mistress. Dizzy upon waking. Perfect. Continue infusion in tea. March 14th, Thomas restless, sweating through shirt and sleep. Dreams disturbed. Adjust quantity. The beauty of his plan was its invisibility. No one questioned Marcus's methods. His food was too good, his service too impeccable. The Whitmores praised him endlessly, proud of their loyal cook, who seemed to know their tastes better than they did themselves. Jonathan often boasted to guests that Marcus was worth 2 servants put together. The irony was not lost on Marcus. As the years turned, the results of his work began to show. Jonathan's headaches worsened. He grew short-tempered and forgetful, sometimes misplacing ledgers or forgetting names. Constance developed fainting spells that left her pale and shaking, her once imperious tone replaced with constant complaint. Thomas, meanwhile, became gaunt and irritable, prone to fits of rage followed by exhaustion. Charleston's physicians came and went, prescribing tonics and diets. Marcus prepared them all, following instructions with visible devotion except for one minor alteration here and there, one small addition no one would ever taste. And still, he waited. He could have ended them in a single night, but that would have been mercy. Marcus wanted understanding. Before the end, he wanted them to feel themselves unravel. Sometimes he wondered if he had become as methodical as they once were. He remembered how Jonathan had described a punishment years earlier. Discipline is correction applied over time. Marcus smiled when he thought of that. He was only following the master's own principles. By 1829, all 3 Whitmores were under constant medical supervision. The plantation ran less efficiently. Debts mounted. Marcus could see the fear beginning to flicker in their eyes, the fear of losing control. Yet they still dined each evening at 6 sharp, and he still served them, calm and silent, hands steady as ever. That year's final journal entry summed up his philosophy in a single line. Poison is not a substance, it is time disguised as patience. And so he continued the doses, smaller now, almost invisible. He didn't want them dead yet, not until they reached the moment when each meal he served would taste not of pleasure, but of dread. In the spring of 1830, the Whitmore plantation prepared for a celebration that promised to restore its fading prestige. Thomas Whitmore, now 23, was to be married to Caroline Ashford, daughter of a wealthy Charleston merchant family, whose dowry would temporarily ease the family's growing debts. For weeks, the big house swelled with visitors, deliveries, and the constant clamor of preparation. It was, as Constance liked to remind everyone, an event worthy of Whitmore lineage. For Marcus, it was something else entirely. It was an opportunity. The kitchen became the heart of that grand occasion, pulsing from dawn until long past midnight. Servants rushed with trays of oysters, baskets of citrus, and barrels of imported sugar. Marcus oversaw it all, his calm authority commanding more respect than any overseer. He had been with the family long enough that no one questioned his instructions. "You there," he'd say softly to the younger cooks. "Watch the flame, don't let it touch the glaze." His tone was steady, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating, adjusting, remembering. Every course of that wedding feast was a test of his mastery. He'd spent years perfecting balance, how much to add, how little to leave. He wanted nothing immediate, nothing that would spoil the occasion. He wanted the celebration to shine so brilliantly that no one would see the shadow beneath it. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and heavy with humidity. Marcus rose before the sun and began assembling what would be remembered as the finest dinner in Charleston that year. 12 courses, soups, fish, roasted fowl, beef with wine sauce, pastries layered with sugar and fruit. He worked in silence, moving between the stoves like a conductor at his orchestra, each movement measured, every gesture deliberate. When the guests arrived, the plantation filled with the sound of violins and the scent of magnolia. Caroline Ashford looked radiant in lace and pearls, her youth glowing beside Thomas's restless pride. To everyone watching, they appeared a perfect match, wealth bound to old name, beauty joined to influence. But Marcus saw something else in Thomas's eyes. The same cruelty as before, only better dressed. He knew what kind of husband Caroline had married. He'd served men like him his entire life. Dinner began at dusk. The guests sat around the long mahogany table under the soft light of crystal chandeliers. Marcus moved among them silently, pouring wine, refilling plates, unseen yet everywhere. The meal was flawless, every flavor harmonious, every texture balanced. The guests marveled, toasting the couple, the family, and above all, the cook, whose genius had made such an evening possible. No one noticed that the Whitmore family's portions were served separately prepared hours earlier, with ingredients Marcus had gathered himself. It was not yet a death sentence, merely a continuation of his slow design. But it was a step, a careful tightening of the noose that only he could see. When the final course arrived, a spun sugar confection shaped like a bouquet of roses, Constance dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Marcus," she said, her voice soft with rare warmth, "you've outdone yourself." "Thank you, ma'am," he said, bowing his head. Later, when the guests danced in the hall and laughter echoed through the house, Marcus stood alone in the empty kitchen, the smell of wine and candle smoke lingering in the air. He opened his journal to a blank page and began to write. Tonight, the house believed itself reborn, but beneath the music lies rot. The son has married, and through him the sickness continues. I have fed their lineage another mouthful of time. He set down his pen and looked toward the dining room, where the sound of glasses clinking mixed with the dull hum of celebration. It would be remembered as a night of triumph, a union of families. But Marcus knew it for what it truly was, the quiet turning of a blade, sharpened over decades, now pressing gently against the throat of the Whitmore legacy. By the year 1831, Marcus had become the one man the Whitmore family could not live without. His presence was as constant as the chiming of the grandfather clock in the hallway, predictable, dependable, unquestioned. The Whitmores trusted him with their comfort, their meals, their very lives, and that trust was the finest disguise he could have ever worn. The plantation had changed since the wedding. Thomas and Caroline now lived in the main house, occupying the east wing, while Jonathan and Constance slowly receded into the routines of aging. The patriarch's health had declined in ways even the doctors could not explain. He was thinner, weaker, his once booming voice now raspy and impatient. Constance, too, had grown fragile, her skin pale as flour, her energy failing even as she clung to the duties of propriety. Yet in their decline, both turned increasingly to Marcus. When Jonathan's appetite vanished, it was Marcus who coaxed it back with tender soups and gentle seasoning. When Constance could not sleep, it was Marcus who brewed the teas that soothed her nerves. When Thomas needed to impress visiting merchants, Marcus crafted feasts that made his guests gasp with envy. The more they depended on him, the more invisible he became, not from neglect, but from comfort. They could no longer imagine their lives without him, and that was precisely how Marcus had planned it. In the kitchen, Marcus ruled quietly. The other servants followed his word as law. He spoke sparingly, but listened to everything. He noted every shift in mood, every change in appetite. The family's failing health did not alarm him. It fascinated him. Each symptom told him something new, how far the body could bend before it broke, how much suffering could be disguised as natural illness. He wrote down every detail in his journal, sometimes smiling faintly at his own precision. Mistress Constance's appetite diminished, but praises the broth daily, believes it medicinal, increase valerian dosage. Master Jonathan, weakness in joints, temper worsening. Begin tincture of foxglove in evening tea. Thomas, energy erratic, drinks heavily. Experiment with brandy infusion, monitor reaction. No one suspected anything. In Charleston society, the Whitmores' decline was considered unfortunate but unremarkable. Aging poorly, like many who've lived too well, people whispered. Meanwhile, Marcus perfected his craft. His skill in the kitchen was now legend across the county. Neighbors often requested his service for grand dinners, weddings, and holiday gatherings, offering generous payment to borrow the Whitmores' famed cook. Jonathan, always eager for status, proudly obliged. Those borrowed evenings gave Marcus a peculiar kind of freedom. In other houses, he saw how differently the world moved, how even among the wealthy, cruelty wore different masks. But those nights also taught him something more valuable: how easily men trusted a servant who fed them. They never questioned the hand that filled their plates. That lesson deepened his patience and sharpened his understanding of power. When he returned from such events, Constance would greet him with rare gratitude. "You do us great credit, Marcus," she once said, her voice brittle but sincere. "Our name still carries weight because of you," he bowed, hiding the quiet triumph in his eyes. Later that night, after the house had gone still, Marcus sat at his small table by the fire, turning the quill between his fingers. "Trust," he wrote, "is the sweetest poison of all. Once given, it cannot be recalled, and its effects are irreversible." Outside, the magnolia trees rustled in the soft spring wind. The Whitmores slept soundly in their separate rooms, unaware that their most loyal servant had already buried them in his heart. Their every comfort depended on his mercy, their every meal upon his discretion, and Marcus, calm and precise, intended to extend that mercy only until the very moment it served him no more. By the end of that year, Jonathan's hands trembled so violently he could barely lift a fork. Constance's memory slipped in and out, like light, through thin curtains. Thomas spent more nights away, drowning his restlessness in Charleston's taverns. Yet every one of them felt secure, knowing Marcus waited faithfully at home, watchful, quiet, and indispensable. It was the highest form of mastery, not to kill by stealth, but to be loved while doing it. By the early months of 1832, Marcus had perfected not just the art of cooking, but the art of illusion. He understood by now that survival depended on theater, not the kind performed in parlors or town halls, but the subtle, daily performance of harmlessness. He had learned to smile when spoken to appear deferential yet eager to please. He made mistakes on purpose, small ones, to keep suspicion at bay. Once every few weeks, he would deliberately oversalt a soup or burn a loaf of bread. It never happened often enough to seem careless, only enough to remind the Whitmores that even perfection could err. Jonathan would grunt in irritation, but wave it off. "The boy's tired," he'd mutter, spooning up another serving. "He's worked hard." Marcus would bow his head, apologizing profusely, and then retreat to the kitchen, where he would record in his journal, "Error manufactured, response satisfactory, no suspicion." He had learned this form of misdirection from observing the family themselves. They too maintained illusions, the illusion of wealth despite mounting debt, the illusion of harmony despite the rot of resentment that filled their home. The Whitmores' entire world depended on appearance, and Marcus had become fluent in that language. Constance in particular had grown fond of him. She treated him almost as a confidant now, speaking freely in his presence. "Sometimes I think this house would crumble without you, Marcus," she said one afternoon as he served her tea. "You're the only one who doesn't disappoint me." He thanked her softly, masking the thought that burned in the back of his mind. "The house has already crumbled. You just haven't noticed yet." Jonathan, meanwhile, continued to weaken. His skin had taken on a yellowish hue, his breath shallow, his gait uncertain. Yet he clung to his routines: breakfast at 7, brandy at dusk, prayers muttered over ledgers long since meaningless. Marcus adjusted, his measures carefully, adding just enough to sustain decline without drawing alarm. Thomas, on the other hand, had become unpredictable. Marriage had not softened him. If anything, it had deepened his cruelty. He drank more, raged more. Caroline often retreated to her room in tears, her once bright spirit dulled by fear. Marcus would see her sitting by the window in silence, her hands clenched in her lap. Once, when she fainted at the dinner table, Marcus rushed forward to help her before anyone else moved. For a brief moment, her eyes met his, wide and frightened, but beneath that fear, he saw something else: recognition. That night, he wrote in his journal, "She knows something is wrong in this house, but she does not yet know what." To the rest of Charleston, the Whitmores remained a symbol of Southern refinement. They hosted dinners for local gentry, though fewer came each year. Guests praised the food, the decor, the civility, all illusions Marcus maintained with care. He prepared elaborate spreads that dazzled the senses, ensuring no one noticed Jonathan's trembling hands or Constance's fading energy. Even the servants had grown complacent, believing Marcus's composure meant contentment. None suspected that the same quiet precision that seasoned the Whitmores' meals also seasoned their decline. He began experimenting with new methods that year: slower infusions, subtler blends, ingredients that could weaken without pain. He tested them first on pests, sometimes on himself, just enough to know the limits. He understood now that patience was its own weapon, sharper than any knife. One evening, Thomas caught him scraping the bottom of a burnt pot. "You're slipping, Marcus," he sneered. "Don't think I haven't noticed." Marcus smiled faintly. "Yes, sir. I'll do better." Thomas smirked. "See that you do." That night, Marcus prepared Thomas's coffee with special care, measuring each spoonful with deliberate calm. He made no notes in his journal afterward. Some lessons, he decided, were best left unwritten. By year's end, Jonathan was confined to bed. Constance took to her chair near the window, her once commanding presence reduced to murmured complaints about her nerves. Thomas began coughing after every drink, yet still demanded his nightly brandy. And through it all, Marcus remained constant, the trusted servant who never faltered, never questioned, never tired. When visitors asked after the family's welfare, he would answer with quiet assurance, "They're in good hands, sir." And they were, though not in the way anyone imagined. The winter of 1832 brought the first true silence the Whitmore house had ever known. Jonathan confined himself to his room, too weak to descend the stairs. Constance spent her days half asleep in a haze of herbal fumes. Thomas drank through the afternoons, and the servants spoke only in whispers. The grand plantation that had once echoed with the noise of command now sounded like a place waiting to die. And then, in February, Caroline Whitmore gave birth to a daughter. The cries of the newborn broke that long silence like a hymn rising from the grave. The child, named Elizabeth, was delicate and pale, her small fingers curling around anything they touched. When Marcus first saw her, wrapped in lace and resting in her mother's arms, he felt something unexpected. Not affection, but hesitation. The sight stirred an unease he hadn't known in years. Here was an innocent, untouched by the family's corruption, the only Whitmore who had not yet earned his hatred. For weeks, the baby's laughter filled the house. Even Jonathan, propped up in bed, demanded to see his grandchild. "She'll carry our name forward," he rasped. "A sign that the Lord hasn't forgotten us." Constance nodded weakly, though her eyes seemed to dim whenever she looked at the infant, perhaps knowing that the family's future rested on a life too small to defend itself. Marcus continued his work without interruption. The meals, the tonics, the quiet manipulation of balance all carried on as before, but he avoided the nursery. Caroline, now thin and weary, often sent for him when she was too weak to rise. "Marcus, could you bring broth?" Or, "Marcus, would you light the fire?" He obeyed every request, yet each time he stepped into that room, he kept his distance from the cradle. The child's clear blue eyes unsettled him. They were not Whitmore eyes. They belonged to someone yet untainted. He began to write about it in his journal. February 23rd, the child born among the ruins. "I feel no anger toward her. Perhaps that is weakness, but the plan must have limits. One must know where justice ends and vengeance begins." Thomas showed no such reflection. He viewed the baby as a symbol of ownership. He boasted to visitors that his daughter would one day inherit the estate, that she would be raised to understand order. Marcus listened, his expression fixed, as Thomas spoke those words over brandy and smoke, his own hands trembling from the sickness Marcus had nursed into him. By spring, Caroline had grown paler still. The childbirth had drained her, but there was something deeper, a dull ache that no tonic cured. She asked Marcus one night, "Do you ever believe a house can remember?" He paused before answering. "It remembers what's been done inside it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, as if hearing more than he'd said aloud. That evening, she left her portion of supper untouched. When Marcus returned later to collect the tray, she whispered, "Whatever has taken them, let it end with me." He closed the door quietly behind him. In his journal that night, He wrote only one line: "Mercy must exist, even here." For the first time, he altered a pattern. Caroline's food remained untouched by his hidden additions. The next morning, she asked him for tea, and he served it plain, a simple kindness that no one would ever know. Weeks later, Jonathan died in his sleep. Constance followed within a month, her heart finally failing under years of strain. Thomas buried them both with all the ceremony he could afford, his body shaking, his face pale and waxen, and while the mourners spoke of lineage and legacy, Marcus watched Caroline and the child standing apart from the crowd. The wind caught the baby's lace bonnet, and for a brief moment, Marcus thought he saw the family's corruption drifting away with it. That night, as he washed the dishes from the funeral meal, he looked toward the nursery door, faintly lit by candlelight, and whispered to himself, "Let her live." It was not forgiveness, it was restraint, the one act of mercy in a life built on deliberate ruin. By the beginning of 1833, the Whitmore plantation stood like a grand monument hollowed from the inside. The master and mistress lay buried in the family plot, their names carved into marble that gleamed against the overgrown grass. Caroline, still weak from illness, rarely left her room. Thomas had inherited the estate, though his once arrogant stride had turned into a staggering limp. He blamed fever, then drink, then fate. He never considered that the source of his decline stood beside him at every meal, calm and obedient, refilling his glass with quiet precision. Marcus had entered the final stage of his long design. What began as anger had evolved into method, and now, after 2 decades of planning, it reached the point of perfection. He no longer needed to measure or calculate. He knew the family's thresholds as intimately as their habits. He could tell by the color of Thomas's lips when the night's portion was correct, by the way his hand trembled on the glass, whether the effect would take hours or days. The art of poison had ceased to be chemistry. It was choreography, a slow, graceful dance between servant and master, truth and deception. But this final act required more than patience. It required precision. Marcus wanted the end to be neither swift nor suspicious, neither cruel nor merciful. He wanted clarity, the understanding that the Whitmore legacy had not been undone by rebellion or fate, but by its own corruption, distilled and fed back to it through the hand it had once commanded. His experiments grew bolder now, his tools more refined. He had long since mastered tinctures and infusions. Now he worked with layered effects, combinations that created symptoms too contradictory for physicians to explain. A little powdered aconite to slow the pulse, a trace of nux vomica to revive it again, a rhythm of agony and recovery that mimicked natural decline. No one suspected. In Charleston society, Thomas Whitmore was spoken of as a man overburdened by tragedy. The irony was exquisite. Caroline, meanwhile, existed in a kind of twilight. The death of her in-laws had drained what little strength she had left. She spent her days reading near the nursery window, while Elizabeth played on the floor beside her. Marcus often brought her meals himself, though he continued to leave her untouched. Each time he entered that quiet room, the sight of mother and child softened him not with pity, but with restraint. He knew she suspected him, though she had never said so. Their eyes would meet for an instant, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared recognition of what he was doing and why. One evening, Thomas came to the kitchen reeking of liquor, demanding supper though it was long past midnight. He slurred Marcus's name, knocking over a chair as he entered. "You think you're smarter than me," he spat. "You stand there with that face, acting like you're better than us." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Would you like something warm, sir?" Thomas sneered. "Don't sir me. You're a cook, a servant. You don't get to look at me like that." He stumbled forward, grabbing Marcus by the collar, but the strength wasn't there anymore. His fingers shook, his breath wheezed, and after a moment he released his grip and slumped into the nearest chair. "God, I feel wretched," he muttered. Marcus poured him a drink, steady and silent, and placed it in his trembling hand. "This will help," he said. Thomas drank deeply, not noticing the faint bitterness beneath the brandy's sweetness. When Marcus returned to his journal that night, he recorded it plainly. "The process nears its end." His body weakens, but his arrogance persists. The balance must hold agony without suspicion, suffering without speed. The recipe is perfected. Outside, the air smelled of salt and summer rain. The plantation's fields, once teeming with workers and life, lay, half-tended and overgrown. Inside the great house, only 3 souls remained awake. Caroline, whispering a lullaby to her daughter upstairs. Thomas, groaning faintly in his sleep. And Marcus, seated at his small desk by the kitchen hearth, the firelight flickering against his calm, unblinking face. The revenge he had nurtured since childhood was nearly complete, not through violence, but through mastery. Every breath Thomas drew was borrowed time, measured in doses, written like a recipe perfected over 23 patient years. By the autumn of 1833, Marcus had reduced life in the Whitmore household to a set of repeating motions, as exact and predictable as the turning of a clock. Every movement, every sound, every flicker of candlelight carried meaning. The rhythm of the house had become his instrument, and he alone conducted it. He had learned that Thomas awoke later each morning, now once proud and punctual. The young master now lingered in bed until the sun had climbed halfway over the pines. At breakfast, he coughed into his napkin, blaming the damp air, though Marcus knew the truth rested in the dark syrup he stirred into the man's morning coffee. Constance had once demanded chocolate at every breakfast. Thomas, out of habit, had inherited that taste, and so Marcus continued the ritual, honoring the family's traditions, even as he dismantled them from within. Each meal had become a record of human weakness. Jonathan had preferred sauces rich and savory. Constance had favored sweetness to disguise bitterness. And Thomas would eat anything placed before him, so long as it arrived steaming and fragrant. Marcus wrote in his journal that week, "The body follows habit as faithfully as the sun rises. A man may command 100 souls, but he cannot command his own hunger." It was that predictability that made his work so easy now. Marcus had discovered that he no longer needed to innovate. He needed only to repeat. Repetition itself was power. Every dish, every drink, every polite bow of the head was another turn of the invisible screw tightening around Thomas Whitmore's life. Caroline watched it happen. She said nothing, but she saw. The knowledge lived behind her eyes, fragile but undeniable. Some nights, she sat across the table from her husband and barely touched her food. She'd look at Marcus, her lips parting as if to speak, but the words never came. She was trapped by her own dependence, by the need to protect her child, by the quiet terror that speaking truth aloud would seal her fate as surely as his. One evening, as Marcus cleared the table, Thomas waved a lazy hand. "You're wasted here," he said, his voice thick with drink. "A talent like yours, why, you could cook for the governor." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm content where I am, sir." "Content," Thomas repeated, amused by the word. "That's a slave's comfort." Marcus met his gaze, then calm, steady, unflinching. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "It is." Thomas laughed and returned to his wine, unaware that Marcus had already written the night's end long before it began. As autumn deepened, Marcus began charting the weather alongside his observations. He noted how the humidity affected the strength of his infusions, how cold air slowed the body's reaction. The precision pleased him. He no longer thought of his actions as revenge. They had become a science, a study in decay conducted under the guise of servitude. October 4th. Rainfall heavy, house damp. Increased dose in tea, reaction slower but more complete. Observed trembling at midday. October 10th, patterns confirmed. Physical decline matches lunar cycle. Mental confusion follows every new moon. He even began to test the smaller effects, how fatigue altered perception, how the body compensated for gradual poisoning. To the outside world, Thomas was merely aging beyond his years. To Marcus, he was an experiment nearing completion. But there was something new stirring beneath Marcus's discipline, an awareness of how much time he had devoted to this single purpose. He had built his life around their destruction so completely that he now found himself studying emptiness, measuring the absence that was soon to come. Sometimes, while writing by candlelight, he would catch sight of the child, Elizabeth, toddling through the hallway, her laughter echoing faintly. He always paused then, pen held midair. In her voice was something he could not bear to taint, a note of purity that no revenge should reach. He wrote, almost to remind himself, the pattern must end with him. To continue would be corruption of purpose. And so Marcus waited, watching the last threads of sickness weave through Thomas's body as winter approached. The final act would not come yet, but the rhythm was clear now. Each heartbeat, each breath, another repetition of decline. The house still stood, but within its walls, the Whitmore bloodline was already dying by design. The first days of March arrived, cloaked in gray rain, and a heaviness that seemed to hang over the Whitmore estate like a veil. The plantation that once rang with the noise of workers and horses now moved in slow motion. The cotton fields had gone fallow. The air smelled of wet soil and neglect. Inside the main house, Thomas Whitmore's footsteps echoed faintly down empty halls. Caroline's soft coughs came from the east wing where she nursed her fading strength. The child, Elizabeth, was the only sound of life, her laughter occasional and brief, like a bird unsure if it was safe to sing. Marcus felt the end approaching not as excitement, but as inevitability. 23 years of patience had brought him here to the threshold of closure. He no longer needed to experiment, he knew precisely what he would do, and when. All that remained was timing, the final refinement of a ritual that had been rehearsed in silence for decades. He began by preparing the kitchen as if for a feast. Copper pots were polished until they gleamed like mirrors. Knives were sharpened. Herbs hung to dry along the walls. The air smelled faintly of citrus, vinegar, and iron. To anyone who might have entered, it would have looked like the work of a devoted servant readying for an occasion. And indeed, an occasion was coming, one that would appear a celebration but end as judgment. He made lists, careful and neat. The ingredients he would need, the order of preparation, the timing of the meal. Each note he wrote carried the precision of scripture. Cream fresh, from cellar. Eggs 6, flour sifted twice, chocolate shaved fine, mixture final, no trace. He recorded nothing about the true additions, the tinctures he had distilled over the previous year. Extracts that worked not by speed, but by certainty. Each was a patient killer, invisible, flavorless, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion and confusion. When combined, they would mirror the symptoms of sudden illness, a malady beyond the reach of any Charleston physician. The irony satisfied him. For years, the Whitmores had treated the enslaved as instruments of labor, devoid of will or intellect. Now, every breath they took depended on the skill and calculation of the man they had dismissed as property. He chose the date with deliberate care. April 17th, Jonathan Whitmore's birthday. Though the patriarch had been in the ground nearly a year, it was also Marcus's own. The shared date that had haunted him since boyhood would now bind their names forever. A fitting symmetry, he murmured one night, closing his journal. A feast for the living and the dead. The week before the celebration, Thomas called for Marcus. His health had worsened, constant headaches, swelling in the joints, a deep fatigue that made his once commanding voice sound fragile. "We'll mark Father's birthday this year," he said, forcing a smile. "The family needs a little joy again." "As you wish, sir," Marcus replied evenly. Caroline said nothing. She only looked at Marcus as Thomas spoke, her expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he saw no fear, only resignation, as if she understood that resistance was no longer possible or necessary. That evening, Marcus walked the perimeter of the garden one last time. The foxglove he'd cultivated years ago still bloomed in wild clusters, their purple bells swaying in the damp wind. He ran his fingers over one stem, feeling its smoothness, its quiet potency. "It's all grown now," he whispered. "All of it." He spent the next nights in solitude, testing small batches of frosting and glaze. He adjusted flavor, texture, and color until each element appeared flawless. He worked without haste, humming a low tune that Aunt Hester had once sung decades earlier, a song of endurance, of waiting for the season to turn. By the time the 15th of April arrived, the cake pans were ready, the tinctures measured, the servants dismissed early. Only Marcus remained in the kitchen, a figure outlined by firelight, his face calm and unreadable. The house above him slept in uneasy comfort, unaware that every breath it drew was balanced on his final act of precision. The long years of humiliation, the silence, the patience, all of it would end soon. In 2 days, the Whitmores would sit down to dinner, as they always had, the ritual unbroken, the servant invisible. But this time, when Marcus carried the cake into the dining room, it would not be service. It would be justice, sweet, deliberate, and absolute. The morning of April 17th arrived drenched in sunlight, the kind that seemed too bright for what the day would become. The air smelled faintly of magnolia and sea salt drifting up from Charleston Harbor, carried inland by a soft spring wind. The Whitmore house stirred early. Servants scrubbed floors, polished silver, and arranged flowers in the dining room, though the grandeur felt forced, like an echo of former wealth. Thomas had ordered the celebration himself, a modest dinner to honor his late father's birthday. He had no idea he was also honoring another man's. Marcus rose before dawn, as he had done every day for 23 years. His movements were steady, almost ritualistic. He washed his hands in cool water, buttoned his cleanest linen shirt, and tied the same faded apron he'd worn since Jonathan's final illness. He stared for a moment at the small mirror above his cot. The face staring back was not the boy who had once burned his hand over a candle flame. It was older, calmer, stripped of fear. "Today," he said softly to himself, "the work ends." He began the preparations in silence. Flour sifted into a bowl, sugar measured precisely, butter beaten to a pale froth. Every sound, the scrape of the whisk, the tap of a spoon, the crack of an egg, marked another heartbeat toward the culmination of his long design. The cake would be simple but elegant. 3 tiers of dark chocolate sponge layered with cream, frosted with a glaze smooth enough to catch light like polished wood. To anyone else, it would seem a gesture of loyalty, a servant honoring his master's family. But to Marcus, it was a requiem. As the morning passed, he moved between tasks with effortless rhythm, no shaking hands, no hesitation. He had spent years perfecting this moment. The ingredients lay before him like instruments of faith: cocoa, sugar, milk, and the tinctures he had stored in small glass vials, clear as water and deadly as scripture. He added them carefully, drop by drop, each measured to ensure no single trace would betray him. The mixture emitted a faintly sweet aroma, indistinguishable from innocence. By noon, the cake was in the oven. Marcus stood by the open door, watching the batter rise, the heat shimmering like ghostly hands inside the chamber. When he closed it, he did so gently, almost reverently. The house was quiet now. From the parlor, he could hear Thomas laughing with Elizabeth, a rare sound, hollow and performative. Caroline sat by the window, pale and unmoving, her face turned toward the garden. When she saw Marcus pass the doorway, she did not speak, but her gaze lingered. It was the same look she had given him weeks earlier, not accusation, but recognition. The cake cooled by mid-afternoon, and Marcus began the assembly. He trimmed the layers evenly, stacked them one atop another, and smoothed the glaze across the surface until it gleamed. When he finished, he stepped back, studying his work. It was beautiful, flawless, even. A masterpiece that would outlive its creator. He could almost hear Aunt Hester's voice behind him, low and steady. "You listen before you move, boy. Listening'll keep you alive." Now he moved, and no one heard. At 6 o'clock, the Whitmores gathered for supper. The table was laid with candles and crystal, the faint shimmer of elegance trying to disguise decline. Marcus served each course as he always had: soup, bread, roast, wine, his face calm, his hands sure. When at last he carried the cake into the dining room, a hush fell over the table. "Good God, Marcus," Thomas said, half smiling despite his exhaustion. "You've outdone yourself." "Happy birthday, sir," Marcus said, placing the cake gently before him. They cut into it together, Thomas, Caroline, even little Elizabeth laughing at the sight of the sugar flowers, and for a brief moment, the house seemed almost human again. Marcus stepped back, standing in the doorway, unseen but present. He watched them eat, each bite another verse in the story he had written. When it was done, he turned quietly and returned to the kitchen, where his packed bundle waited by the door, a small parcel of clothing, coins, and the worn leather journal that held his life. The sun had vanished behind the pines when he stepped outside. The air was cool now, carrying the sound of cicadas. Behind him, laughter rose once more from the dining room, faint, fragile, and fleeting. It was the sound of a family celebrating the hour before its end. As twilight deepened over Charleston on that April evening of 1834, the Whitmore house glowed from within like a lantern in the dark. Candles burned low in their silver holders, their flames bending with the draft that whispered through the dining room's tall windows. The table gleamed under the chandelier, its polished mahogany surface crowded with plates, cutlery, and glasses filled to their brims. In the center stood the cake, 3 tiers of dark perfection, shimmering under a thin glaze of chocolate so smooth it reflected the light like glass. The family gathered slowly, more from ritual than appetite. Thomas Whitmore lowered himself into his father's old chair, his hands trembling slightly as he smoothed his cuffs. Caroline sat opposite him, pale and silent, her daughter Elizabeth balanced on her lap. The child giggled at the sight of the confection before her, pointing at the spun sugar flowers arranged across its surface. "Pretty," she whispered. Thomas smiled faintly, pride flickering in the hollow space where his health had once lived. Marcus stood nearby, still as stone, the perfect servant. He had carried the cake into the room moments earlier, setting it down with such care that no one noticed his lingering touch upon the table. The smell of warm chocolate filled the air, rich and soothing, blending with the faint scent of magnolia drifting through the open shutters. "Marcus," Thomas said, his voice hoarse but still touched by command, "you've given us beauty tonight." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied quietly. He stepped back as Caroline picked up the serving knife. Her hands shook as she cut the first slice, the silver edge sinking through the soft layers with a muffled sigh. Thomas poured himself a glass of port and nodded toward Marcus. "Sit the child a piece," he said. Marcus hesitated only for a moment. "I'll prepare something lighter for her, sir. Too rich for a little one." Thomas laughed weakly. "You think of everything, don't you?" "Very well." He raised his glass. "To family," he said, "and to the memory of father." They drank, and the first bites were taken. The texture was divine, moist, dark, and dense, the glaze melting across the tongue with a sweetness that left no trace of bitterness. Caroline smiled faintly. "It's perfect," she said. "Of course it is," Thomas replied. "He's been perfect since the day Mother found him in that kitchen." Marcus lowered his gaze, bowing slightly. "You're very kind, sir." He stood there in silence as they ate, his face unreadable in the flickering candlelight. Every movement in the room seemed magnified, the clink of forks against porcelain, the rustle of napkins, the faint sighs of contentment after the first bites. It was the sound of satisfaction, of trust. As minutes passed, the air thickened with the aroma of wine and warmth. Outside, the night wind picked up, rattling the shutters gently. Caroline reached for her glass but missed, her fingers unsteady. Thomas chuckled, reaching to steady her hand. "Too much port?" he teased. But then he blinked slowly, heavily, and frowned. "Strange," he murmured. "Feels like the room's spinning." Caroline pressed her palm to her temple, her breath catching. "Yes, it's warm," she whispered. Marcus watched. He did not move. Thomas tried to rise but sank back into his chair, confusion replacing mockery. The candlelight shimmered on his damp forehead. Caroline reached across the table, her voice trembling now. "Marcus, fetch the doctor." He inclined his head. "At once, ma'am." But he didn't go. He stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor as the family began to fade. Thomas clutched his chest, the color draining from his face. Caroline gasped for breath, one arm around her daughter, whose laughter had stopped. The sound that followed was not a cry. It was the silence of realization, the sound of years collapsing into a single, final moment. Marcus closed his eyes. The ticking of the dining room clock filled the space between heartbeats. When he opened them again, Thomas was still, Caroline slumped forward, her hand still wrapped around the child's. The candles flickered, their flames wavering in the heavy air. Marcus exhaled once, softly. Then he turned, walking out through the kitchen door into the cool night beyond. Behind him, the house fell quiet, its silence complete at last. The Whitmore plantation lay in near-perfect stillness as night settled fully over Charleston. The lamps in the great house flickered until only one remained, lit the dining room chandelier, its glow stretching thin over untouched plates and empty chairs. Outside, the air had cooled, the scent of rain drifting in from the river. Somewhere in the fields, a whippoorwill called, its lonely cry the only sound that dared disturb the silence that had taken root. Marcus moved through that silence like a shadow that had learned to breathe. He crossed the kitchen, unhurried, his bare feet silent on the wood. On the table by the door sat a small bundle, one change of clothes, the last few coins he had hidden away over the years, and the worn leather journal bound with thread. He untied it, flipped to the final page, and dipped his quill in the remaining ink. His hand was steady. April 17th, 1834. It is done. They passed as softly as they lived loudly. The house is quiet for the first time in my memory. I leave with nothing but what cannot be taken again: time, patience, and proof that silence can speak. He waited for the ink to dry, then closed the journal and slipped it into his bundle. From the dining room came the faint creak of a chair, a sound so small it could have been the house settling. He paused. His instinct, honed from decades of obedience, told him to return, to check, to make certain. But he didn't. He knew the pattern of death well enough now to recognize its rhythm. There was no saving to be done. The Whitmores were beyond pain, beyond repentance, beyond anything that could undo what had been written into their blood generations before. In the corridor, the clock struck 9. Each chime rolled through the house like a confession. He moved toward the back door, passing the nursery. Through the half-open doorway, he saw a faint light, the small oil lamp Caroline had kept beside Elizabeth's cradle. The child slept, untouched, breathing softly beneath a quilt patterned with faded roses. Marcus lingered there for a long moment. He could smell the faint sweetness of milk, the scent of life unspoiled by greed or cruelty. The sound of her breathing light, steady, was the only proof that innocence had survived within these walls. He whispered, "Live differently." Then he blew out the lamp. Outside, the night wrapped around him like a shroud. The path leading away from the house was slick with dew, the soil soft beneath his steps. He did not look back. Behind him, the house loomed in darkness, its windows glowing faintly from the last of the candlelight. He imagined the morning to come, the servants entering to find the family lifeless, the panic that would follow, the doctors arriving too late to diagnose anything but mystery. They would call it illness. They would say the Whitmores died of bad food or divine punishment. No one would look to the man who had served them faithfully for 23 years. No one ever did. By the time dawn rose over the marshes, Marcus was miles away, walking the narrow road toward Charleston. He carried his bundle over his shoulder, his pace unhurried, his posture straight. The sun climbed slowly behind him, gilding the horizon in pale gold. Birds began to call again, their songs rising over the distant hum of insects and wind. The world felt larger now, quieter. He stopped once at the edge of the river where the road forked and looked down at his reflection in the dark water. The face that stared back was lined but peaceful, its eyes no longer the eyes of a servant. He thought of Aunt Hester's voice, soft, sure telling him to listen before he moved. He had listened for decades, until the silence itself had spoken. Marcus turned toward the east and began walking again, his figure shrinking into the light. Behind him, the Whitmore estate stood empty, its great house sinking slowly into history. By noon, the last candle in the dining room guttered out, leaving only the echo of a single man's patience, an act of vengeance so precise it looked, to the world, like destiny.